Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here with Christo Grozev, the lead researcher for Bellingcat. I think you've been delving into a lot of questions that journalists have been looking at and trying to answer for the past year or more, particularly about Ukraine. I wanted to start off with asking about something that's been at the top of people's minds, which is what is going on with Prigozhin? Richard Moore, the head of MI6, made some comments in a rare public speech, and they're really quite colorful. It was, what did he say? It was that the Wagner boss was a traitor at breakfast, pardoned by supper, and a few days later invited for tea, and was talking about how difficult it was even for the intelligence world to make sense of it. What sense do you make from this?
I agree that it was unprecedented, but I don't think it was unpredictable. And I personally have been on the record predicting an attempt by Prigozhin to take power by force, at least since the end of 2022. Actually, I must have been the only person who was yelling in joy on the day that Prigozhin attempted the coup, because I won a bet. And I also thought that if he had succeeded, this might have been a sort of a transition into a normalcy in Russia after he's deposed, after he would take power, but it didn't work out. It was inevitable because, first of all, Prigozhin had been cheated out of his business. The Ministry of Defense had tried to take out and privatize Wagner, or to sort of steal Wagner before the war started. Then they had to bring him back to the table because they couldn't do without him, but he had a grudge against them, and that lasted throughout the 2 years before the attempted coup. Then it was clear, both from open source data, but also from us talking to a lot of people within the Wagner organization, because you have to talk to the bad guys to understand what's happening, that they felt that Prigozhin is a much better suited head of a new Russia than Putin was. So there was this pressure, peer pressure on Prigozhin himself to actually do something about it. And he spoke out against the Ministry of Defense, but people below him understood that to be an attack on Putin. So what happened on that day was, from my point of view, inevitable. It was predictable. The way it ended was strange, and it just points to a deal. A deal was made, and a deal is usually made in Russia with both a carrot and a stick. Now, the stick here is the interesting wild card. What could have happened to actually pressure Prigozhin into stopping something that looked like something with at least a 50% chance of succeeding? And we heard from some intelligence sources that were leaked that there may have been pressure on the kids, on the children of some of the senior people at Wagner. So that would be a very traditional stick that the Russian intelligence services would use. Maybe a kidnapping of somebody at the top, maybe a threat of one, or so forth. And the carrot in this case was a better deal through Belarus. And this leads probably to your question, where is Prigozhin now? And Prigozhin is in Belarus, that's no question. There's no question about it. We actually traced his phone pings to Belarus over the last couple of weeks. There was a clear attempt to mislead the public in that he moved to St. Petersburg. He sent a body double to actually appear in St. Petersburg. He did attend a tea with the Kremlin. And that just all points to a weakness of Putin's position, because you can't declare somebody a traitor in the morning, as Richard Moore said, which is dog whistle in Russia for pending assassination. Everybody expected him to be taken out before the end of the day. And a couple of days later to accept him for tea. That puts Prigozhin at a much stronger position than Putin at this point in time.
Well, let's return. There was a great quote you had in an interview with Julia Yaffe a few months ago, where you said the Russian government cannot afford to kill people for just being morons, because otherwise they'll run out of people in the security services. Putin kills people that oppose him, those people that betrayed him, but not morons. So is Prigozhin a moron or a traitor, or a bit of both?
No, he's a traitor, but the political capital that Prigozhin had accumulated before he went on this semi-coup was such that Putin couldn't actually ignore it and couldn't have people assassinate him. He wanted to. He desperately wanted to. But it was no longer possible. Why was it not possible? A couple of days before the coup, there was the sort of monthly social polling of several of the Russian pollsters that showed that Prigozhin was clearly the #2 most trusted politician. He's not even a politician. He's ranked as the #2 most trusted politician in Russia, behind Putin. And he had his own people that support him within the Ministry of Defense, silently within the FSB, and within the population at large. So you can't easily take out somebody like that. But he's a traitor. He's not a moron.
So one of the assertions we hear a lot in recent weeks is that the attempted mutiny, whatever one wants to call it, weakened Putin in the eyes of the Russian people and the Russian elite. Do you agree with that? And how do we know that? How do we measure what the elites are thinking? Or can you talk about that?
Well, first of all, it definitely weakened Putin in front of the people, the electorate. There's no question about that. I mean, you saw for the first time people come into the street to actually cheer somebody who opposed Putin on that day, who cheered somebody who Putin had called a traitor. This is what we saw with the convoy of Wagner leaving Rostov and then moving on to Belarus. Now, that clearly shows to a lack of empathy to Putin among the general population, despite what they would answer in social polling. But within the elites, what this gave is an idea of how feasible a change of power is. It just gives a sense of attainability of something that they want to do, but there's a prisoner dilemma where nobody wants to be the first one to actually stand up and sort of metaphorically shoot the first shot. But this gave an idea that this is doable, and even without support and origination from the security services, it's doable. But what if it was supported by the FSB? So I think that's why Putin is weakened, because of this image of how it can be done.
One of the things that I find so fascinating about the work you do is both the sources that you have access to and how you analyze them. And you've talked about how you discovered a surge of panicky midnight communications between the FSB, GRU, and FSO on the night of June 22nd, 23rd, which was, I believe, a day before Prigozhin launched his coup attempt. How can you talk about your methodology, what you have access to the extent you can, and how you...
No, man, I've spoken up about something, the large part of the methodology, which is that we are using Russia's corruption against itself. We're using Russian corrupt government to actually buy data from government officials that disclose and shed light on the wrongdoings of the government itself. And for as long as there's a dictatorship in place, I think I'm comfortable with doing that. Not every journalist is, but I am comfortable and I can justify every decision. That night of data, the preceding night of phone calls and the night of phone calls on the day of the night of the coup was extremely enlightening, because not only did it show that the Kremlin had an inkling that something was about to happen, but on the night of the coup, it showed that top generals from the GRU whose job was to stop this, instead of actually spending all of their time talking to colleagues and plotting how to stop Wagner, well, the chief general in charge of the war in Ukraine made 45 phone calls that night to his lover, and only like 11 to his colleague, right? So it was almost like they were binge watching a Netflix show, and between episodes they were like, hey, what do you think is going to happen next? That shows you how disinterested or uninterested at the top level they were in whatever outcome that coup would have the next morning.
So they were just waiting to see what happens in the next episode?
Yep.
How could it have gone down differently? I mean, what were sort of the variables there?
Well, I mean, I think if Prigozhin had prepared a bit more for this, I think he was forced into a corner because he found out that there was an assassination plot on him. So if he had prepared a bit more, he might have been able to convince more than the 7,000 Wagnerites to join him on that particular convoy. I've spoken to a few of the ones who didn't join, and they said, we're not sure he's not going to cut a deal with Putin halfway through this project. And that's why we're not going to join, because we don't want to be let out to dry. So I think it could have gone differently if he had planned it for at least a week as opposed to a couple of days. And it could have gone differently if some of these people who are calling their girlfriends in the middle of the night had actually taken a slightly more active role in supporting him. But it was possible for it to go differently.
So what are the possible scenarios or outcomes that could happen now? So Prigozhin is in Belarus. Maybe a nice place to retire. What does he do from there?
Well, first of all, I mean, we have to understand that him being in Belarus and pledging to make the Belarusian army the second army in the world, which he did today, is a strong signal. It actually makes domestic politics in Russia, it throws it in chaos, because what Putin had in plan for the 2024 elections, barring a victory in Ukraine, which is now not on the horizon, he was planning to annex Belarus. That would be the second best scenario for him, right? This is no longer possible because Lukashenko acquired an army that will defend them from that. And literally, Prigozhin yesterday said, we're here in Belarus, and we're going to prepare for future military action, maybe in Ukraine, maybe not, but we will defend Belarus if need to. Now, that's a clear message that Putin can no longer easily annex Belarus. So actually, Putin is left without a plan B for the 2024 election, and that's not nothing.
Where will Prigozhin at this point get the financial support he needs for his mercenaries?
I believe, and this is just a hypothesis, that part of the better deal that he got from Lukashenko compared to the old deal is related to his work in Africa. That will continue under the sovereign sort of support of Belarus instead of the sovereign support of Russia. But the cut he's going to get from the diamond and gold mining is going to be bigger than he had before from Russia.
Well, that raises an interesting question, because we've usually looked at Wagner and Africa as a lever for Russian influence. Does it now become a lever for Belarusian influence, or just pure financials for Prigozhin?
Well, it was always both. It was always a money-making thing and a lever for influence. Lukashenko and his son, they've always had an ambition to actually have some influence in Africa as a sort of a little sort of compensation for the fact that they're a tiny country with zero sovereignty versus Russia. So that is going to be something they will try to leverage in their relationship with Russia as well.
Well, I could ask endless questions, but I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience who have questions for you. So I want to take a few from the audience. We have, I think, third row, someone raising their hand. If there's
Third row, yeah.
There's a microphone?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Here you are.
Thank you so much. Laura Haim from French TV. Do you have any information about General Surovikin, who apparently was arrested and who in January was the commander-in-chief of the aerospace force? He disappeared, and a lot of people are saying that he was extremely close to Prigozhin. Do you think he's involved in the plot, and do you know where he is at this moment?
We do not. We did contact his wife, and his wife, 3 days after the coup, told us that he still hasn't come back from work, and she's still waiting. So I think that's the status at the moment. It's a Schrodinger's cat situation where he's either arrested or not arrested. That's what Putin is actually incentivized to do. He doesn't want to show that he's losing generals left and right, that he finds traitors in every room he looks. So this ambiguity is quite strategic. He's not going to easily announce that he's been arrested.
I think there's a question in the back there.
Hi, I'm just curious, if you're purchasing information from sources, how are you ensuring that the information hasn't been manipulated in some way to drive an outcome?
We use the same approach as any traditional journalistic organization, or I use that at least in my team. We make sure that we get at least a second data source from a completely unrelated origin. And ideally, we do that longitudinally. So we try to find data that predates, that in terms of leakage, that's something that has become leaked years ago before actually somebody had a vested interest in poisoning the data, and that should be consistent with what we get from a source at the moment. But of course, we start with the assumption that the data is poisoned. So first we have to validate the data for ourselves before trusting it. It's part of the process.
I think towards the back there.
Hi, Christo. Misha Glenny from the IWM in Vienna. Christo, the Russian military appears to have improved since the counteroffensive began, both in terms of its defensive lines, but also the possibility we're hearing of an offensive, a counter-offensive in the north. To what do you ascribe that apparent renewed coherence in Russian military strategy?
Misha, that's a great question. Actually, this morning I was talking to somebody with inside information on what's been reformed partly in the Russian army. And there are two things to say to this. One is that they borrowed part of the positive experience from Ukraine. They've, on a lower level, started using the principle of operational autonomy, which never existed in the Russian military doctrine before. And they're trying to take responsibility. They're trying to report truthfully upwards, which never happened before. I'll give you, if I have a minute, I'll give you a great anecdote of how it was before. So this is one reason, that they're actually much more autonomous on a regional basis than before, and they're being allowed to. Now, this has the risk, or the risk for Ukraine and for the rest of the world, that it may become institutionalized. And from what I hear, the top Putin and people around him are planning an actually replacement of Wagner with an in-house, decentralized, professionalized, NATO type, American type, 101st Brigade type army that will be that institutionally. So I think that is the most likely answer. And just to give an example of how it was before, we did a major investigation in 2015 of the Mariupol shelling by Russia in the first phase of this war. And we got access to about 10,000 intercepted phone calls of Russian soldiers on the ground in the middle of the night shelling Mariupol, Ukrainian territory. And what we could see is that any failure, any casualty on the Russian side was misreported incrementally and exponentially at every level of the reporting upwards. And in one particular case, somebody putting the grenade into the grenade launcher backward and causing 8 of the comrades to die, by the time it got to the Kremlin, it was reported as an Israeli drone struck us, yeah? And think about it, this is 2015, drones were not even a thing, so that's what's now gradually changing.
Back on the left.
Christo, how would you rate the Ukrainians as practitioners of tactical deception?
Of tactical?
Tactical deception.
Again, the Ukrainians are great at that. They are also very decentralized and competitive, and this is playing a great service to them at this point, because they're able to compartmentalize their active measures on the front line, even from their colleagues. And in a country where there's a lot of corruption, unfortunately, and a lot of penetration of Russian operatives in the security services, that's the only way for them to maintain through complete compartmentalization and competitiveness, and they're great at that.
Up in the front.
Oh, wait for the mic, sorry.
Sorry.
A word about how the Ukrainians are able to take advantage of the Prigozhin and Wagner setback in the war on the ground?
Well, I mean, they were going to actually take major advantage if that had continued longer. So they had all the plans to do it, and now the only thing they can do is actually hope that there's a continued split and demotivation, which there is. I mean, again, Prigozhin disappearing for 3 weeks was bad for Ukraine. Now him appearing today and calling the front line disgrace for Russia, what's happening on the front line, disgrace for Russia, this is playing in Ukraine's hands. So the more Prigozhin speaks in the next few weeks, I think the better for the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
And do you think he'll continue to speak a lot?
He will continue to speak, yes.
Back in the round table.
Thank you very much. Stephen Shapiro from the Atlantic Council. Sir, your work is extraordinary. I was curious how much of it feeds the investigations into war crimes in the Ukraine?
That's a great question. The traditional Bellingcat, my colleagues whom I had to kind of physically separate from because I'm now based in the United States, they continue primarily work on justice and accountability, and that is literally gathering evidence for war crimes. This is a unique war. We've spoken about this actually at last year's Aspen Ideas. It's a unique war because there's never been a war that produces so much open source, widely available evidence on a daily basis of, among other things, war crimes. And this makes it impossible for law enforcement agencies themselves to harness enough researchers to actually gather that and make it systematic and make it prosecutable. And this is a place for an organization like Bellingcat, but many other NGOs. Bellingcat has the advantage of having dealt with court admissible evidence before, and we know, Bellingcat knows where the pitfalls are of a journalist gathering evidence and then soiling it along the way. But many NGOs do that now. We've trained many others to do the same. So I think we'll see a unprecedented number of prosecutions from this war relative to the number of war crimes, just because there's more things that cannot be ignored by otherwise lazy law enforcement agencies.
I think we had a question over here, gentlemen.
Edward Luce from the Financial Times. Christo, could you talk a little bit about why you had to leave Vienna and the degree of sort of Russian penetration of the Austrian security services?
Very simple answer, and I would not like to elaborate more, but I received alerts from several law enforcement agencies, including from the Austrian one, that they can no longer ensure my safety in Austria or in much of the continent in Europe. And I was advised to stay put in the United States, where at least according to traditional sort of conventional wisdom, Russia is not likely to attack a journalist. Yeah, Austria is unfortunately heavily penetrated by Russian interest, both at in the judiciary, the security services. There's an actual open criminal case against two members, ex-members of the domestic security agency of Austria, who were surveilling me, my family, and more than 30 other people of interest to Russia's security services. That tells you a lot.
Christo, I'm a member of Ukrainian parliament, Andrei. I'm just a very simple question. Do you believe that Russia, after the Ukrainian victory or the ending of the war, can be democratized with a new leadership, with any Yeltsin #2, or as a big specialist of Russia? Your personal opinion.
I have a very sort of cynical answer to that. I think that cannot happen from the bottom up. That cannot happen from a grassroots perspective, but the elite, the moneyed elite, including their Siloviks, which are paid by the moneyed elite, they have an interest in actually reverting to normalcy. They have an interest in being able to spend their money, and they realize that the only way to achieve that is by, well, the same thing that happened with the mafia in the 90s in Russia, where they had to legitimize their business and then became a quasi-normal business people. The same thing that happened in the United States centuries before that, the same thing can happen in Russia, with the elite actually forcing an acceptable degree of democracy in Russia.
Actually, I have a corollary question for that. The U.S. strategy, particularly with the slew of sanctions at the beginning of the war, was supposed to put pressure on oligarchs, on the elite, and seemed to have in some ways failed to move the needle. Was there a different strategy?
No, I think that was the only strategy, but the follow-up was not good, because you were supposed to engage with the oligarchs at the same time and not keep kind of the higher moral ground and say, you should have talked to us before. You should have, well, the United States should have worked privately with the oligarchs while sanctioning them and saying, here's a scenario where you actually can be desanctioned, and that didn't happen. And actually the Kremlin used that strategically as well, because we're investigating one of these cases, but it seems the Kremlin instigated sanctioning one on-the-fence oligarch by the European Union, because they would know that, or they would expect that that would bring them back to the law to the sort of home, right? Mm. So I think there was a bit of a problem in not following up on the sanctions.
The middle there?
I've read that the West was very concerned about Prigozhin's march on Moscow, that they thought that he would be much more destabilizing to the world than Putin, which led to Blinken's telephone call reassuring Russia that we had nothing to do with it. Do you believe that theory?
Well, I mean, I believe the theory that this may have been the conclusion of analysts in Western intelligence services. I disagree with that. If that were true, I think that the shortcut to actually ending Putin's regime would have been through breaking the prisoner's dilemma within the elite. The elite were slow, like they experienced something that you can call slow boiling the frog. Gradually their lifestyle got incrementally worse, and they couldn't use their money, and they couldn't fly around, they couldn't host conservative party parties in London anymore. But it happened gradually, and they want to end this. They want to depose Putin, but again, they don't know who will take the initiative first. If Prigozhin had come in, even for a month, that would have broken that vicious cycle. That would have been the trigger to break the prisoner's dilemma, because they cannot tolerate a North Korea 2.1 scenario in Russia. So I was seeing this peak, this terrible newcomer, Prigozhin, as very temporary. But of course, it's a hypothesis. You can't be sure. So I can understand the opposing view as well.
In the back?
Stuart Bernstein, former ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, and we have the ambassador here from Denmark. Why haven't the sanctions been more effective? And I was told, I once moderated a panel with Michael Hayden of CIA and Ephraim Levy from Mossad, and they said Putin was the richest man in the world. What do you know about that?
Well, I mean, I believe he is, because a lot of the money he holds sway over are not in his name, but not even earmarked for him. They're earmarked for something called the Stability Fund, which means that every big Russian state-owned or quasi-state-owned company had to contribute a certain percentage of their, especially their international revenue to that fund. So of course, because Putin has singular control over the direction of how that money can be used, it is incomparable to any individual's wealth that can be accumulated ever, even to a sovereign individual in the Arab world, for example. So, but I think the sanctions did work. I mean, the sanctions work to the extent that you cannot find more than a couple of oligarchs who actually are happy with the current situation. But them being unhappy does not make a coup. That's the thing. Somebody needs to help them make a coup. And this could be the FSB, right? This could be also literally somebody steering them in the direction of bribing the generals around Putin, who sold them the idea that the war is winnable within a week, to now tell him, oh, we've won the war, so let's just end the war. So all of this is actually doable. We're in the gateway of a multiverse where Russia has 6 or 7 possible scenarios in about six months. One scenario that is not possible is that Putin can be as strong as he was a year ago. That is out of the question.
We're just about out of time, so one last question. You've talked about having to leave Europe. What would it take for you to feel safe being back in Europe? Would Putin have to be gone? Is that?
Yeah, and then a certain time after that must pass before the people that I've heard in Russia who lost their jobs because we outed them no longer have jobs. So, but it's doable, it's foreseeable.
Any predictions on Putin's tenure?
Before the next elections.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you for the audience questions.